Live. Hello, everyone. I'm Erica, and today I'm here with one of my MRes professors who's graciously agreed to meet with us. I'm really excited for this because Harry's got a very broad range of work that he's kind of gotten up to. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I know this is kind of against the normal time. This is we normally do things later, but I'm glad we kind of got connected and got together. So Harry, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself? Let us know who you are, what you do, what you get up to, and how you're doing today, this fine morning, afternoon for you.
Sure. Thanks, Erica. Thanks for having me on. So I think probably the first thing I should say is you very kindly promoted me ahead of my time. But I know professor has a slightly different meaning in the US, the UK. But professionally, I'm a senior lecturer in zoology at the University of Roehampton, where I had the great fortune of teaching Erica a year or so ago. And there, my research is on the ecology and evolution of social behavior. Mainly, most of my research has been on wild social mammal systems. Particularly, I'm kind of interested in understanding why it is that individuals within groups vary in behavior. So, we sort of think of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, and that kind of this idea of survival of the fittest that kind of gives us this idea of this one single optimum animal that every individual is sort of striving to get towards. And the evidence is actually that there is lots of variation, and that variation isn't just noise around an optimum, but that variation, those differences are maintained. And so I'm really interested in understanding why it is that how it is those differences come about, and what the consequences are for social animals. And then, as well as understanding evolution, I'm also quite interested in then working out how that information about animal ecology and evolution can be applied for animal conservation, or for understanding human teamwork. So what not just pure science, which is I think really valuable and interesting on itself, but also thinking about where that can be applied and what implications that has. So that's kind of me professionally. Yeah,
absolutely. I know. So for those of you who perhaps don't know, the primary animals that I know that you've worked with, Harry, are banded mongoose and mongooses.
Mongooses.
Banded mongooses and baboons. And is it Papio-cyancephalus?
It just depends when you read the literature. The taxonomists like having arguments. I think at the moment I've worked on Chacma baboons, and at the moment there's Papio ursinus. But I think while doing my PhD on them, I think they changed a couple of times. There's always an argument about whether they're species or subspecies, because all the species of baboons, or the Papio anyway, they can interbreed. So where you get the boundaries, say, between Chacma and yellow baboons, you get interbreeding. Same with yellow and olive baboons, and most strikingly when you get hamadryas baboons, because they've got those big names. Really, you get these weird hybrids.
That's a good one. Yeah, it's neat to look at their range throughout Africa and to see how you get these strange hybridization zones. And the classic one that everyone brings up is like the Kinda baboons, who may or may not be a hybrid or a subspecies that. They had kind of a weird sociality there going on for a while. I think I want to say that they've kind of been relegated to a subspecies, but it's been quite some time since I've kind of looked at them. But baboons versus banded mongoose, that's kind of an interesting dynamic there, right? These are two very different animals.
They aren't. They're both highly social. They both live in really discrete groups. But there are very differences within the groups in terms of reproductive systems. So you've got baboons are just the classic standard sort of reproductive system where a few males fight for access to females, and every female reproduces. Whereas banded mongooses are cooperative breeders. So you get unusually for cooperative breeders, most females in the group breed to some extent. whereas in some cooperative breeders, you just get a single dominant breeding pair. But once the females give birth, the entire group cares for that communal litter.
Right.
So it's not just the direct parents of the litter, but every individual, and actually often the non-breeding males, really, because they've got nothing else to do. Mainly because the mongooses live around the equator, parents tend to have already moved on to the next reproductive effort, and they've left their litter to be cared for by other individuals in the group. So you get this cooperative effort to bring up this communal litter, which obviously is quite different. And that aspect of cooperative care is itself an evolutionary puzzle again. Why are these individuals foregoing their own reproduction and spending time raising offspring that are not their own direct ancestors, direct relatives?
Right. Yeah. That's interesting. Do Ben and mongooses have like a hierarchy that's like linear?
Not in the same way like you might be thinking about primates. So yeah, but baboons are a classic example, and macaques similarly. They tend to have a very linear hierarchy where if A beats B and B beats C, that means that A always beats C. In mongooses, less so. There's definitely a queuing system for the males, so the reproduction tends to be dominated by the top 2 or 3, and when I say top, that usually is the oldest 2 or 3.
Okay.
Whereas, but the females, there is a bit of it. The older females do control reproduction, but it's less of a obvious. It's less a steep slope, if you like. Younger females still reproduce as well, although they not necessarily to quite such the same level of success.
Yeah. So that's really strange that you've got. I mean, that's like an interesting dynamic, because I know with kind of cercopithecoids, usually it's the strongest males who tend to be the younger ones that tend to be higher up in the hierarchy, or like mid-adult to younger. And then you've got younger females that tend to rank above the older males because they're more fertile, right? So that's neat that you've kind of got a reverse there in the banded mongooses.
Yeah, I guess probably the reason is that mongooses are really good at dying. It's I think I saw someone saying something about another species, but it totally applies to mongooses, which if mongooses could die twice, they would. So they're lunch for everything. They're small. They're only a kilo and a half. So they're small, furry things that run around. In East Africa, where there are leopards and pythons and lions don't really care about them too much, and all sorts of other things that eat you. And so they tend to, and the pups are completely helpless and get picked up by the storks.
Oh my God!
They just if they make it to adulthood, they're already doing really well. And they also have an unfortunate habit of if a bush shakes, their first reaction is to stick their head in it to check out what's going on. And often the answer is it's a python or a leopard. So then that's end of mongoose. So you do see a bit of that sort of rank question. You see a bit of drop off, and some really old individuals don't rank as highly, but not many of them make it. Not many of them make it to that age. So it tends to be if you've made it to the older age. So when I say older age, it's probably middle age in terms of how old a mongoose can be. So we've done the project I worked on. We've had mongooses get to 11 or 12, but really, really rarely. Like the median age lifespan is about 3. So you tend to, if you made it sort of 3 or 4, you tend to be in a pretty good position at that point to sort of run things.
I had, if you had asked me what is the lifespan of a banded mongoose, I wouldn't have been able to tell you. I would have been like, oh, I don't know. It could be 10, it could be 20. That does.
It can be long. Yes, I think in captivity they lived even longer. But it's just that they, in captivity, obviously protected lots of things, and out in the wild, everything that they will get killed by, they do get killed by, basically.
Oh my God. Yeah, I remember. You'll have to refresh my memory, but when we were chatting in one of our sessions in the MRes, you were telling us about how you guys were doing some work with the kind of general cognition of mongooses, kind of like, oh, we're gonna run this experiment, but they were like, I can't remember the details, but they were like almost a bit too dumb to follow through with the experiment, you.
We were. I mean, we were doing. Well, part of the research we were doing was trying to look at some some differences in cognitive function and differences in learning and things.
Right.
But while we were doing that, there was a really big comparative study that came out in PNAS on sort of mammalian cognition across, I forget, like 100, 150 species. But I just remember the fact that of all of these species, mongooses came out bottom. Stone cold, stone last, bottom. I think like they were all been given the same task, and the mongooses had failed at it 0% of the time. They had failed, as in never hadn't got it right 0% at all. So
they made the very bottom of the list.
They did, yeah, which rather was a bit disappointing. I mean, like all cognitive tests, they're probably much better at something else. Like if you give them a millipede to sniff out a millipede and dig it up underground, they'll probably do pretty well. So it's obviously all those cognitive tests are with a little bit of pinch of salt. But yeah, it was a nice story anyway. Like,
oh my God, that's so tragic that I can just all the banded mongoose stands out there were like, no, well, I can't say I'm surprised. Jay Dawn in the side chat has an interesting question. They want to know, are mongooses in carnivora? What are they closely related to? Badgers? Because once you kind of go cross-continental, the folks over here in the US, we're kind of like, okay, is it a badger? Is it like a muskrat? Or so
they are, you're right, they are carnivores. They're in the feliform carnivores. So actually their closest sort of outside of mongooses, which obviously is quite a reasonably specious clades, you've got meerkats in there as well who pretend they're not mongooses. The next sort of closest clade is hyenas.
Really?
Which you wouldn't necessarily think of, yeah. But,
wow, I never would have guessed that. Because I knew like hyenas and hyenoforms, they do tend to straddle that line between the canids and the feliforms of the carnivorans, and they've got like this really interesting evolutionary history over in Africa and kind of Eurasia with the bone crushing hyenas versus your more sleek dog like hyenas, and then our 4 extants are like all very different. And I remember years ago, I was shocked when someone told me, yeah, hyenas, they're more closely related to cats than they are to dogs. And I was like, no, really? Because I had like the Lion King hyenas kind of branded in my head, but I banded mongoose and meerkats with kind of in that line with them.
If you go up from mongooses, the next sort of major branch you get to, yeah. I mean, you're stretching my taxonomy a bit. I'm not the greatest taxonomist in the world. So beyond that, you go somewhere into carnivores, and I'm not quite sure what comes next.
Yeah.
But yeah, they're not where you exactly instinctively you think of. It's a fair point to say they like sort of badgers and other mustelids, because that is instinctively where you go. But actually, they obviously are not that distantly related from them, because they are within the carnivore group. But there's a couple of other groups of carnivores that are more closely related now.
Well, yeah, mustelids would have been my guess. I was like, oh, okay, yeah, it's because I'm trying to compare it to things over here in North America. But once you get into like biogeography, you start getting into some really weird connections, I feel.
Yeah, I mean, I'm saying this. I'm hoping right now. Someone's probably going to go on Wikipedia and tell me I'm wrong, because I'm not a very good taxonomist.
So of the two, banded mongoose versus your Choctaw baboons, which did you enjoy working more with and kind of observing?
You told me you would ask this beforehand. I say you can't ask anyone. I can't ask a biologist to pick favourites. That's like they have it's like asking you which is your favourite child. No, they're both equally different. No, they both of the pluses. So I mean, baboons were definitely my first love. I mean, that was how I really got into science, was working on the baboon project. When you follow, especially fieldwork on baboons tends to involve, you spend a long time following a single or a couple of groups for, days on end. So you really get to know each individual, really distinctly. That you know all their personalities. But in the evening, the field team sits round, and you talk about them like people. Exactly, you just have and so that so it's hugely rewarding. It's months and months on end, and you can really get into their sort of social lives and social interactions. So that's fantastic. But similarly, I mean, the mongooses, I mean, they just constantly surprise you. Most of the papers we've written on them probably started out trying to answer a completely different question, and then what fell out was just this crazy, what they weren't meant to be doing, and then we had to kind of try to work out why. And they do have this amazing social system. So one thing I mentioned that is even more weird about them is that when the females give birth, they almost always give birth on exactly the same night underground. So they're all pregnant and they all conceived at the same sort of time. It's a few days. It's a few days window. And when we do ultrasound scans, the fetuses are at quite different sizes, and yet they will almost always give birth at the same time.
Is that connected to what is it like? Is it like a hormonal chain reaction, or is it like the first one it begins to go into labor, and then the rest are like, oh, it's almost like a sympathetic thing?
How they do it, we don't know. This underground den is a bit of a black box, but I mean, in terms of why they do it, we pretty good evidence now that it's simply because of that part of that communal breeding system. And the fact there's a lot of pressure on pups to disguise who their parents are, so no one can distinguish, so no one can favour them, or they can't be attacks. Because if females give birth too early, so sometimes at these they do give birth asynchronously. If they give birth too early, then the other females know, well, those aren't my pups because I've not given birth yet. So
they won't care for them as generously.
Well, they'll just kill them. I mean, more than that.
Really?
Yeah. So they'll be very aggressive towards them.
Okay.
Because
I wouldn't have pegged banded mongooses for an infanticidal species.
Oh yeah, very much. There's a lot of warfare. There's a lot of really high rate of death. Actually, my colleague of mine, Faye Thompson, has written a couple of really nice papers on this. But a really high rate of death from interspecies, intra or species attacks. So
they leave the burrow and everything's trying to kill them, and then they come back and they might kill each other as well.
Basically.
That's just.
But then they don't want to give birth too early because then someone's going to try and kill their pups. But if they give birth too late, then their pups are sort of at the back of the queue, because when about after a month in the den, they go out into the big wide world and they get cared for in these one-to-one care relationships with adults. They're called escorts. So they get escorted, and these adults are really important. They know that pups who get escorted have better survival, better growth, all sorts. They get, you can see, they get protected, they get fed, and there's a lot of inter-pup competition. They sort of fight for it, and so if you're born later, so you're a bit smaller, you're at a disadvantage. So we think we've got good evidence from various experiments that the older females can control the timing, and once they start giving birth, it's just sort of go, everyone gets going. Which also suggests that then females are able to delay birth and bring it forward, which is pretty bonkers.
Yeah, a level of control there, boy, that would be nice, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but there's clearly been really strong. It seems like there's been really strong selection for both sides. So everyone just goes on the same night, and then it seems to mean that no one really knows whose pup is whose, right? Because they're all just in this big pile. Then adults can't favour individuals based on their relatedness because they just can't tell who's whose.
Right. Yeah, that's a superb strategy too. I mean, if you're a lower ranking mother or one who's conceived later than the rest, that's really nice to kind of slip them in there without anybody noticing. Victor Jejong in the side chat says it's Labor Day, which is, I guess it would be.
It pretty much is. Yeah, it's true. It is. But it happens a lot because they do it 4 times. You get Labor Day more than once a year in mongooses because they have 4 or 5 litters in a year.
Yeah. So there's no distinct breeding season then. Is it pockmarked with different seasons, multiple seasons?
Not in the system I worked in, but that's probably more of an environmental thing. I worked pretty much bang on the equator, and so there isn't really any seasons. It is a little bit drier in sort of December, January, and so there is a bit of a dip then, some pause in reproduction, but not. It gets going pretty quickly. Not like any of us who live in a temperate environment, and you're used to sort of winter, spring, summer, and autumn. But mongooses live quite a long way, especially further south. Actually, I don't know, but I suspect there's more seasonality there in terms of their reproduction.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Because I've been finishing up my thesis, so I've been eyeballs deep in primates and primates doing different primate things. So it's kind of interesting to compare, what I know about baboons and what I'm sure you know way more about baboons with the banded mongooses, because you've almost got like this nice Venn diagram of like, well, they share all of these things, but there's actually quite a bit that differs with them as well, with regard to their sociality. I mean, I correct me if I'm wrong, but the group size varies greatly between the two.
I think that's hugely environmentally driven. So yeah, I guess mongoose groups really struggle usually. I think, in fact, really struggle to get above 40 or 50, and they have this, again, more weird social system, but they have this weird, unique thing where they evict sort of groups of individuals en masse. So rather than individuals dispersing in one or two, basically when there are too many females, they get there's basically too many females, too much competition for reproductive resources, and so quite a few of those females get kicked out in a sort of splinter group and take some males at the same time. Whereas baboons can be, I mean, probably the average group size of baboons is not dissimilar. It's probably, I suspect, across Africa, probably 30 or 40. I'm totally guessing on that. But you can get baboon groups of up to over 100, especially in really, for example, there's a long-running project run by Dorothy Cheney and Robert Seyfarth in the Okavango, which obviously is very wet. I think reading their book, and they've sort of reported having group sizes up to 100 and more, and tiny home ranges, because there was a lot more food available. Yeah. Whereas the site I work at in Namibia, which is very dry, you get group sizes up to 60, but not much more than that, and usually less than that. And it's huge home ranges. They're the home ranges of sort of 40 square kilometers, rather than.
So there's this concept with mammal sociality, and I know a bit about it tangentially because I had to collect group sizes for my project, but it almost seems, and this seems like very kind of obvious, but it didn't really click for me until I was kind of looking at it all in a single, 111 species, subspecies of primate. Here's all their mean group sizes to what we understand of all that kind of stuff, and changes in group size or group size in general seems to almost be like, okay, this is the root of what your social system is going to look like. How many individuals can you support? Is it beneficial for you to have more or less? And then that's ultimately too kind of constrained by the environment. So do you think that would be a fair characterization that your group size is going to determine a whole lot of what comes next, and kind of being able to almost withstand changes in group sizes is going to be beneficial for you, especially if you're living in a, as you mentioned, kind of a drier environment that's harsher?
That's an interesting question. I mean, group size is clearly in any social system, is a really important aspect. In that classic group size versus anything, per capita benefits, ultimately relationship. And I guess, and that does may have a big influence on where species can live. So the classic sort of time budget models that Robin Dunbar developed, sort of 30, 40 years ago, which had been really based a lot of this, show how the group size determines how much time you have available for other things, basically, because the bigger the group size, the more competition, potentially the more time you have to devote to traveling and foraging, and less time for other kind of important
maintenance
things.
Relationships, the social thing.
Absolutely. And so potentially, but I mean, there are lots of variety within a particular group size in terms of how animals have solved that. In terms of some social systems are pretty, well, simple is probably a poor word, but less bonkers like mongooses, a little more like what we might think of. But I think that's also very much dependent on a whole other set of features, like, as you say, environment, but also how these particular species can manage their social relationships within the group, how they can, how much kin recognition there is, and how that allows you to favour kin or not. So group size is one factor, but there's a whole series of other things that are going to come into play in terms of what social system you develop, and also then it's a feedback loop, right? Because then that creates its own pressures, which then develops things further. Like with mongooses didn't evolve this. We're all going to give birth on one night overnight, but that sort of were pushed that way by these sort of 2 or 3 different competing pressures, which sort of slightly unintended result was this weird synchronization.
Yeah, it's always difficult for me to wrap my brain around, okay, which pressure's primary, right? Because you run into all of these convolutions where this impacts this, and then this may impact 2 things down the line, and then you might have like feedback loops here and there that make things very difficult to find out, okay, well, what kind of triggered all of this in the first place? And I don't 100% know that that's a question we can always answer.
Yeah, I don't think you can. I mean, I think we're all always, as well as human nature, we're very keen to sort of say, well, this is the thing that's driving it.
Yeah.
But I mean, the natural world is ridiculously complex. And in contrast, physicists have this standard model of the universe, which they're all, they're currently smashing things together under the mountains in Switzerland, France, and trying to refine it. But they've still got this model of the universe that explains an awful lot. But just don't have anything close to that. We've got it was obviously the theory of natural selection, which gives us some ideas, but there's still wheels on that. And I think that's partly because of how interconnected and complicated things are.
Oh yeah. I think that there's almost like this there's this difference in outlook from kind of the hard sciences folks who do all the math and sit, as you said, sitting kind of in the dark underneath the mountains, smashing small things into each other to make smaller things, versus the kind of biology aspect that is observing what is already there instead of actively influencing it out in nature. It's kind of like a more passive isn't always a great way of putting it, I suppose, because there's still a lot of experimentation that goes on directly even in ecology, even in field ecology, where you're getting out there and actually exposing animals to stimulus and stuff like that. But it seems almost like a fundamental outlook difference a lot of the time.
I think it's just because you've got a better. I mean, physicists say it's just because we haven't done such a good job of explaining things. I mean, the sort of the physics version of field ecology might be something like astronomy, when you are just observing the universe. But actually, there are a lot. There's not a lot of unexplained, but there are a lot of models, a lot of understanding there, which allows a lot of that to be explained. I think in a probably better way than we've yet done with the natural world under our feet.
Yeah.
Other than we start to have some pretty good ideas, but there's an awful lot that is very broadly explained by some theory, but the individual detail is still, I think, quite a surprise.
Yeah. It seems too that there's always, like in biology, there's this idea of like, okay, nice broad trend, a lot of stuff seems to follow this, and then here's the exceptions pile over here, where like this is when different things are at play. We're not 100% sure what those things are, but it's like, the broads and then the buts, the little asterisk down there, kind of at the bottom.
Kind of. I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, I know our models have an awful lot of noise in them. We can explain the trend, but there's there's a huge amount of stuff going around the noise. Whereas that, and I think a good example is I'm going to get into statistics now, which I know you love, Erica, and it's one of your
favorites. I love it so much.
So if we're looking for a trend, we then, our threshold in statistics and in biology about where we say, okay, we found something, is I think what physicists would describe as 1 star. So you get a 1 in 20 chance of this being down to just random. That's quite a low chance. There's probably something going on. In physics, they laugh at you at that. That's like, they need to be, usually it's 5 stars, which is another order. It's almost like, it's not quite orders of magnitude, but I think that's what it's 4 and a half times or something for high less chance. So you've got this sort of 1 in a 10,000 or something chance, that being down to random, maybe even 1 in 100,000, 1 in a million. Before they start to say, well, we found something, this is not just down to random noise. That's because they can, because they've got a better model going on.
The name of the game is precision, right? It's like, it's narrowing it down to the minutia of the minutia. And then over here, we're like, oh my God, that's below 0.05. Like, that looks good to me. I was going over the PowerPoints that we had for the MRes, where you were like, theoretically this is what statistics should look like, but in biology that's not going to be what you get, because everything is influencing everything, and I think that really sums up biology nicely. It's just like everything's interacting. So when you try to narrow things down, that almost therein lies the challenge. You can't necessarily isolate things. And that's kind of what makes it so fun. But I wanted to ask you, because the challenges in the lab and on the computer, those are one thing. What kind of challenges do you think are kind of specific to ecology and studying social mammals when you get out there in the field?
It's a good question. I think, especially studying social mammals when you get out in the field, is one of the big challenges, and one thing where I've been really lucky is already having some idea of what's going on in the system. Like, whether it's because as you've been talking about, each system is different from each other, and there are some broad trends, but still, if you come to a new study system completely afresh, then actually just working out what's going on and getting some of the background information there, both in terms of doing some of the basic behavioral ecology and collecting some of the long-term data on the individuals you're studying, is hugely time consuming. And I've been very lucky to go and work on projects where some of that's been done already. I think it sort of speaks to the real value of longer term research projects. So projects that have been going for 10, 20, 30, or some projects been going for now 40, 50 years. And they really, the value of those projects is immense. And it's not quite irreplaceable, but it takes 40, 50 years to replace it.
Yeah.
And actually the science you can do just gets more and more exciting as those projects get longer and longer term.
I think that's been partially what's been so tough about the pandemic recently, is that so many of these long-term projects have had to kind of slow things down, or in some cases even put things entirely on hold. The field site that I was communicating with, that I was supposed to go to, every now and again I still check in and I'm like, how are things going over there? They're working on pigtailed macaques over there. And Nadine was telling me, she was like, yeah, I mean, when we finally did get to go back in there, we had to rehabituate to a degree, because this is a very small field site. It's not like, Cayo Santiago, where it's like you've got folks who can still go out there and interact. Because habituation, right, is like this key aspect of studying social mammals or really being out in the field for ecology in general. And when you kind of get a flop in there, the animals kind of get used to your absence, I guess. And I think that's going to be something a lot of field sites are going to be kind of struggling with as we kind of get back into the groove of things.
I agree. I mean, so actually the site I work at in Namibia, I just heard yesterday they're going to be able to start getting back out there, and it's going to be interesting to see how that's changed. I mean, actually, I think I wonder if the site I worked at in Uganda, there's a great team of Ugandans who work there full time, and so that's actually down to just keep ticking over. And I do wonder if that might, I think perhaps something we do have to address in field ecology is historically it's been very much been sort of Westerners going to wherever and doing their research and their project and sort of going home again. And the sort of in-country representation has not necessarily been fantastic. That is definitely changing, but I think I'm rightly so, and I know it's very much at the forefront of lots of people's minds. But yeah, obviously being the realization from the last 18 months or so, you can just get locked out of your field site because stuff happens. Makes you realize that having in-country involvement can be a real strength of any field project.
For those of you watching, we in the MRes program we had a lecture kind of talking about ethnoprimatology. So this idea of like, okay, how do we study primates with local groups, people who live there with these primates all the time, and what one of my biggest takeaway from that was that it's like this has to be a joint effort between everybody. I think Ian Redmond was the one who told us, he was like, the best way to get people to care about conserving an animal that they live with is by giving, by kind of associating a pride with that animal, like the golden lion tamarin in Brazil, where it's on their money, which is very cool and awesome. I wish we had primates on our money here, non-human primates on our money here. But I think that first of all, that's great for the conservation. Second of all, that's awesome for the folks who are there, because this is their country, this is their space. And I think you're right. I think that we have westernized to a degree, to a very extreme degree, field research, and it's great that that's expanding.
Absolutely. I mean, the whole idea of decolonization is obviously that's much broader than field ecology, but it's definitely something I think field ecology needs to face up to. It may result in some quite hard truths, but that is, if you're just sort of flying in, flying out, then you don't really add any value locally, and unsurprisingly, you end up with conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's something that we're going to kind of continue to be working on, which is a good thing. So, on a lighter note, what is your this was the one I was most excited to ask, because I had a list. I have a list of questions that I kind of tailored to like who the guest is, and you'll find this funny and perhaps not surprising. When I ask geologists what their favorite mineral to study is, the answer is not always as enthusiastic. They're like, I don't really have a favorite. They're rocks, but your face kind of lit up when you were like, oh my God, I could never pick. Which, I'm a sentimental person, so I can guarantee you I would get sentimental about the minerals that I'm studying or the animals that I'm studying. But in your field experience, what's been your favorite kind of tale from the field? Be it a fun event or a horror story or, what have you?
Oh, Fieldwork. There's so many. You get so many of those ridiculous stories. I don't know. I was actually just before this, I was looking through a few sort of various collection of pictures from Fieldwork. I think one that springs to mind because I saw a picture of it was when I managed to. So this is on the Namibian site I work at, which you should say is very dry. It's right on the northern edge of the Namib Desert. And we do work in a riverbed, but I mean, riverbeds in Namibia are basically dry for almost the entire year. Just
right.
Sort of actually nice roadways. And I managed, this year we were out there, and one bit of this was flowing. And when I say flowing, there was about a foot wide stream that was running down a bit of it. So not exactly, this is a riverbed that's probably 20, 30 meters wide.
Right.
And I managed to get the car stuck in this one bit of foot wide stream. So I think I managed to get the car stuck in the only flowing river for about 100 miles around. And this was, you have to leave really early in the morning. So this is to get out to the baboons. So this is about 5 in the morning, and it's still dark. I think at that point, it was me and the field assistant in the car, and I managed to get not one but 2 wheels in this, so we're completely stuck. It's 5 in the morning. We're not dressed in huge amounts because we're about to spend a day in the desert. So we just got a t-shirt and shorts on. We're up to sort of our mid sort of upper arms in water, trying to scoop out sand, which of course sand on the water, trying to scoop out,
it doesn't go well. Yeah, it doesn't go too well.
We got really absolutely in there. This is getting hopeless. It's dark. It's cold. We're getting freezing cold even though it's in the desert. So we gave up and just realized, and we couldn't call for help until the sun came up because the radio system was powered by solar panels. Just before dawn, all the power, all the batteries drained overnight. So we were set back in the car. We're freezing cold. At this point, we basically eat all of our food from the day in about an hour because it's cold. It's really awful. And wait for the sun to come up. And finally, the sun comes up. Great. We're ready for help. Someone comes out with another car and throws it out and takes a piss out of me in the car stuck in the river. Anyway, at that point, we've lost. The baboons are long gone for the day, and I was like, and we're freezing cold and no food.
Yeah.
Right, we've got to go home and at least change, get some food. We can't. So start driving home. About 20, 30-minute drive crossing farm tracks, and the car runs out of fuel about halfway home. Because the fuel gauge is on the bottom. We had these 2 really old Land Cruisers. They were sort of 30, 40 years old. I mean, they were amazing. They would go through a brick wall, but loads of things didn't work on them. And the fuel gauge had broken, so we were having to sort of guess how much fuel was left. So the fuel runs out. Right. Now it's getting quite hot because now it's sort of mid-morning, and so then we have to walk the rest of the way, which is not hugely far, but it's like half an hour in the sun. We're kind of, which we're doing anyway, but we're kind of thoroughly fed up at that point. And then finally made it back to camp. I think we called it a day. Called it a day at that point.
Yeah. That's when you check out. That's when you're like, you know what? I've got the message from the universe.
Well,
What have you? It's time to just knock off for the day. We're good. We're good.
That's anyone who's been in the field have 20, 30 stories like that. It's mostly car related. Most of the stuff is all how cars break in inconvenient places.
Yep. Yeah, cart, and then walking back, and that's horrible too, because you've got like, you're standing in the water or whatever, getting freezing cold, and you're like, God, I just wish the sun would come up, and then when it does, you're like, damn, I really wish I was back in that cold water.
Well, this is always, this field site is always a bit of a battle in the morning, because especially you'd be there in their winter, which actually in the desert, you forget, it gets pretty cold at night. I would wake up in the morning a couple of times with frost out there.
Oh yeah.
And you're going out for a day, and it's going to be 35 degrees by about 9, 10 in the morning. So you have to get out before dawn. So you're sitting underneath these cliffs with baboons on, waiting for them to come off, and it's freezing cold. But you don't want to take too many clothes, because you have to carry those clothes for the rest of the day.
Yep.
And so you're sort of like you're the thin jumper, just like shivering, waiting for things to get going. And then of course a few hours later it's sunny and you're sweating. You can't ever remember how you were ever cold.
What would it have been? I think it was my junior year. I went on a trip with my friends out west to the Grand Canyon here in the States, and I was young and impressionable, and I was like, it's a desert. It's a desert. We don't need to bring that much stuff. It's a desert. And one of my friends who had come along had this amazing sleeping bag. This thing looked like a NASA invention. It was like a space age cocoon that you slept in. And I had a $20 sleeping bag from Walmart, and I was like, this is gonna be fine. It's whatever. It's all good. And that first night when we were out there, I was like, oh no. I'm laying on the ground, and it just sucks the heat out of you, and I was like, well, I'm gonna freeze to death out here. And my friend is, in her sleeping bag, just like so cozy. And I ended up having to zip my sleeping bag with a couple of other people, and we were like all huddled for warmth. And we'd been just like absolutely pissed out of her for this expensive sleeping bag the entire trip. And then like a whole road there, and then when it ended up she had the upper hand. Because you're right. People tend to forget that deserts get so cold at night, and then they flip flop in the day.
Yeah, I mean, we used to stuff our sleeping bags with blankets.
Yeah,
we were camping. You camp at this field site. We used to just like, because when it gets to the summer, it is then 25 degrees at night, right?
Yeah,
so 25 centigrade. So it is then you've got this quite extreme temperature. But yeah, in winter we would just get all these blankets and stuff them down into our sleeping bag and snuggle down. It was nice and warm. And you wake up at 5 in the morning or 4 in the morning. They rush you to wake up in the cold, and you stick your nose out.
You're like, all right, here we go. I don't want to get out. Yeah. Yep. That seems to be that's the hardest part, getting up in the morning, because it's so cold, even in warmer field sites. My undergrad research was in Thailand, and when we get up in the mornings, like when I go to sleep at night, it'd be like you're sweating because the day you're still kind of coming off the heat of the day. And then we get up in the mornings, and I'd be like, oh my God, when is it finally going to warm up? I'm freezing to death out here. And the folks who work there were like, you're being such a baby. It's fine. I'm like, okay. So we're all built for different levels of field work. That is Todd, who, for those of you who don't know, Todd is my advisor for my thesis. And he and I had a very funny conversation once where we were talking about Celine, who, again, for those of you who don't know, is a colleague who is currently out in the Democratic Republic of Congo studying bonobos. So she's really roughing it out there. I was talking to Todd about this, and Todd was like, that's just not for me. He's like, field work is really great for some people, for me, not so much. And I think I land in the middle, because I love the field work that I've done. But what Selena's doing, that's hardcore. I don't know that I think I might get the crap beat out of me by that.
The bonobo sites are very remote. They're probably at the really extreme end. They are sort of middle of nowhere, days from anything.
Yeah.
Sites I've worked at being remote, but within sort of an hour's drive of a small town, and 4 or 5 hours drive of a big town. But that's you have to be able to go and get things. Whereas in some of those bonobo sites are really yeah, very much like you're on your own. You know, if you want to get out, get out. It's not a few hours, a few days.
Yep. She when she signed up for that site, for that job, she was telling me about it, and she was like, yeah, you know, apparently like you've got to take your stuff and you have to cross a couple of rivers. And I was like, so you need like good boots. And I was like, oh, do your feet get wet on the boat? And she was like, oh, there's no boat. She was like, carry your stuff on your head and wade through the water. I was like, girl, that is so hardcore. That is awesome. I'm so impressed. I'm blown away by that. Because it's so cool, but it's also like, man, I don't know. It's
I think
once in a lifetime.
You find out a lot about yourself, and whether you realize that very quickly, I suspect, because it's it's not for the faint-hearted.
If you could, this is I didn't tell you about this question because I just had it, but if you could have like a dream study species, like you get to design your perfect experiment and it can be on any species you want, what would it be?
Does it have to be a real species, or can I make up this? Can I make up a new animal that's like?
If we're including extinct species, then the list goes on for me, because I have some of those critters from, golly, I'd love to see some of the Cambrian guys. I'd love to, oh God, from the Cambrian to the Miocene, it's just like everything I would want to lay my eyes on. But no, it has to be an existing species.
Okay. Something I've always wanted to do, which I've never managed to work out yet, would be I really like to be able to study things up and some sort of altitudinal climb, or latitudinal climb, but altitudinal climb. And there are some, for example, there are some really nice species of burying beetle system that a Chinese group started working on, which is sort of social in some environments and less social in other environments. And they can study them up mountainsides, altitudinal ranges.
That's a quick side note on that, because I stumbled across a study on Prospidus monkeys, langurs, grizzled langurs, and it was very tangential, because I was looking, kind of eyeballing the paper, and I was like, okay, is this going to actually have the information that I need? Which was a very frequent occurrence in my literature search. But they found the same thing. They were looking at these grizzled langurs, and they were like, okay, at lower altitudes, they tend to behave almost more, pair bonded, monogamously, so to speak. And then at higher altitudes, their habitats have been less touched. And so they have larger group sizes. And I remember thinking that's not, again, it's one of those things that seems intuitive, but kind of blew my mind. I was like, okay, so altitude have a huge impact on how groups can kind of aggregate, and how they behave. So, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'd be really interesting. I mean, obviously in this fantastical world we just created, I've got the world's largest research grant, so I've got as much money as I like. Having these groups in different, study groups of different environments, and then potentially start doing some sort of translocations to environments, looking at how much plasticity there is in that social behavior versus how much you kind of adapted to that particular environment. With then obvious kind of implications then for things like climate change, environmental change, looking at how social species are going to respond to differences in climate, which you expect, there's a lot of observation data to suspect that potentially not very well in some cases.
Yeah. That's an interesting one. It seems like so paleontologically speaking, it's whenever there's huge climatic change, it's like all of a sudden it's the rise of the generalists. It's like all of these generalists just expand and radiate out, and then once they do, they specialize in their locations, and then all of a sudden you've got all of these specialists, which is really cool. And I wonder if, assume, depending on the direction the climate change thing, which is very definitely minimizing the problem, goes. I too wonder how that's going to kind of hash out. Would you be willing to take some questions, because we have quite a few?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Yeah. So Scott Duke is first, and he wants to know, because this is quite on topic, what has humanity done to endanger mongoose populations that you've studied, and kind of how can we mitigate that? Or what are their threats from as far as human behavior and encroachment?
I mean, it's probably worth saying both of the main species I've studied are not particularly threatened, which is part of the reason you study them because they're everywhere and they're quite easy to access, and you haven't got so many worries about doing, because part of my research is doing quite a lot. We do sort of field experiments, which is not like lab experiments, but you're sort of giving them food, or you're doing things which I guess if you're working on a very threatened species, you might just want to make sure you weren't going to reduce the population by 10%. But they have huge conflict with people and just in being hit on the road, having a habitat destruction and encroachment. But mongooses actually are pretty good at living alongside people. As you said, they're kind of a good generalist, like the rise of the generalist. So the site I work at is in a national park in Uganda, and there's a sort of main tourism centre for the park there as well. So a couple of the groups we work on do live quite close or next to. There's a very plush lodge, and then there's other accommodation for people who work at the lodge, people at the Wildlife Authority, research staff. And the mongooses are pretty good at living in and around those places, and actually doing pretty well from but so like scavenging on the rubbish dump and that sort of thing. But yeah, it's mainly. I mean, they're mainly. They're not very good at getting out of the way. So we do get mongooses to get hit. So they get hit on the road. They have a nasty habit of climbing into engines, which sometimes doesn't end very well. And then general habitat destruction. Habitat destruction. They do ultimately. They can sort of they do need a natural habitat to live in, and human population pressure is pretty huge.
Yeah, and potentially growing. It depends on the location. I wonder. This is kind of a side question that I would love to know on the edge of that. How would that compare to the Choctaw baboons? Because every now and again you get a good viral video of baboons who just open car doors and walk into people's cars or mess around.
I guess not dissimilar. They are probably good. I mean, I think mongooses have a limited adaptability. Baboons are probably the really good examples of species that have really well adapted to human environments. And there's still a lot of conflict there, but Cape Town is one there's been a lot of work done. Where there's a population of baboons that live on Cape Point. They're sort of isolated, kind of cut off by this Cape Town, then sort of cuts them off at the top of the point. And they're very happy walking around the suburbs there and nicking people's biscuits from there.
Yep. Yeah.
And they're pretty intelligent. They kind of work out that if they run at someone and they're all grumpy and scary, they'll generally throw their sandwich at them. So in this trial, if that works, I'll do that again next time. And then they get this label of being aggressive, which I think is unfair. Obviously they can be aggressive to each other, but lots of other animals. But they're good at just working out how, like lots of primates, good at working out how to get what they want.
Yeah, that's very reminiscent of the macaques in a lot of temple tourist locations where they realize they can barter with tourists for peanuts. They'll take their stuff and then they're like, if you want it back, you know what you got to do. And everyone's, I don't want any trouble, man. It's it's very much the attitude because, and especially with baboons, they can be quite big. They can get
obviously their big advantages. They're huge compared to a mongoose. But baboon people that work on baboon research projects where you've got them habituated to you, and then you've never associated people with anything other than just these kind of strange, weird people with backpacks on, turn up and seem to be writing things the entire time. Then there's very little aggression from them, and the odd exception where you put a foot wrong and do something wrong, and then they tell you about it. But it's not. They usually just start, and then you step back, and then they just go on with your day. But yeah, the danger is the moment you associate good or bad things with people, then you're gonna get a reaction.
Yeah, absolutely. John asks, what is the most surprising species, in your opinion, that we have found socialized behavior in? So I guess they're asking more, because I imagine for some people, the idea that banded mongooses are highly social is kind of a surprise, because I wouldn't have guessed that kind of on the outset. So in your opinion, what is kind of the most surprisingly social mammal?
Surprisingly social mammal? That's a difficult question. I think we're discovering in lots of systems sort of some level of sociality where we didn't think there would be before. So it's probably isn't surprising, but there's now a lot of evidence where initially orangutans would have been thought as being very solitary. that actually there's now evidence that there is a potentially a much sort of larger scale social system going on there. Not necessarily there, like classically you think of not getting orangutan groups going around, but there is some level of social structure. Not social mammal with the most surprising level of sociality. That's a difficult one. I don't know really. There's lots of lots of aspects of sociality to some extent. I mean, you're right. Probably mongooses are. You probably wouldn't see them initially and think.
Yeah.
They're probably
I mean, for me, that's the low hanging fruit answer for me. I would have just been like, and mongooses. I don't know.
I know. Well, all that meerkats. I mean, they're I think as a social biologist, you grow up knowing about mongooses and meerkats. Doing their thing. So they're almost like a textbook example of where you expect to find them. I mean, I think there's an argument to say that it's very difficult to find any mammal that you could say is truly solitary. But then, what is social? I've just spent a couple of days arguing with a reviewer about what a social species is. And I think that's always a question that comes up: is when do you stop being social? Because everyone, like a classic example, leopards. I think people would generally put into the solitary category, but they still, you still obviously have to be social to reproduce, and actually there is some evidence of sort of overlaps in home range between individuals. It might suggest some sort of higher level sociality in that aspect, and that you still have some idea about who's around you and who's next to you, and who you're related with.
Yeah, I think, God, that's a big one. Defining things in biology, because the field where everything is a gradient. It's like, okay, I don't know that there's, can a line even be drawn? Tends to be like, I take the pacifist answer, so I'm always like, oh, I don't know. Who knows?
As behavioral ecologists, behavioral biologists, we absolutely love an argument about terminology. Which is probably our weakness. I know I've been in discussion groups at various institutions where, the non sort of behavioral ecologists have just been like, why are we still arguing about, what to call this? Let's just say what it is and get it, move on. So we love to categorize things, and just the natural world is not all black and white. That whole point at the start you're saying about like different species. Actually, taxonomy is trying to put things into baskets when everything is sort of, you don't sort of suddenly wake up and go, no, now today we're two species. Yesterday we were one species. That process of divergence is continually going on.
What a fun concept or conversation rather that the biological species concept is. What a fun non-controversial topic.
Let's avoid that. That's basically what you just. That's like that's basically the entire your first year of an undergraduate biology degree. It's like, what's a species? And then everyone's heads explode a bit.
Yeah. That's every now and again on this channel that conversation will come up, and I'm always just like, oh, that's a really good question. How to answer.
There is no right answer.
Yeah, exactly. Vandalia 1998 wants to know, is there any particular reason some mammals, like bonobos and hyenas, tend to be more matriarchal and others, like chimps, more patriarchal? I would imagine you would place maybe hemidrized baboons in that latter category as well.
Well, the two examples you cite there, I'd argue that it can depend a bit on dispersal system as to which sex tends to disperse between groups, and often that, and more often than not, it tends to be males that will disperse between groups, and then in that case, you tend to find that the females are more of the. Whether it's what you describe as a matriarchal society, I don't know. But for example, baboons to the females, I think it could be well argued, are the centre of that society. Those matrilines make up the core of the group and this real sort of core social structure. Another classic example is elephants. Again, and actually the older matriarchs have huge amounts of knowledge about where to go and something in really harsh times. Chimpanzees, I say that because in chimpanzees it is weirdly the opposite way around as with people, as with us. Female disperse between groups and males stay within the group, so that potentially allows those coalitions to exist a bit more. But then think about lions and it's the other way around, and you get male coalitions. So there's probably, like all things, there's probably no one real one single reason why things have turned up, and how often within groups you get male and female sort of structures and coalitions going on. But I think in terms of how permanent those are, really depends on which is the dispersing sex, and so how long those can persist.
Yeah, I would 100% agree on that. I think that there's an interesting thing where it's almost like the classic comparison that people tend to make is like, okay, in the Pannons, it's like you've got chimps and you've got bonobos, and they're very, very different, and they're separated by a river. Why are they so different? And I think when you consider, like, kind of like you mentioned, like, what do you mean by matriarchal and patriarchal? Because there's this idea of like single individuals, like dyadic interactions, where it's like, okay, who supplants the other? And then you've kind of got like what kind of social system is the group rooted in, and it's natural. So it's like defining those terms can be kind of difficult. But as always, I think that saying it's probably a lot of things tends to work.
I mean, I think which sex is philopatric. Obviously, clearly makes a big difference as to how permanent your social bonds and that structures can maintain. And in the classic matrilineal societies, where females basically never leave the group, then you've almost got this inheritance of these structures moving, going down the female line, and these very complex social systems. Whereas in those same systems, when males are moving about, then clearly those alliances they form are necessarily potentially more temporary, because they don't hang around so long, and they're usually fluid depending on the how the situation's changing, why the males are coming in, and then obviously you get to the evolution of that, where in some cases males need to form coalitions. In chimps, they're aided by being part of the same group, but in things like lions and other species like that, then these males have to form up these coalitions in order to beat other coalitions, and so it's an arms race.
Yeah, and lions and things like that, the coalitionary behaviors can also help bring down bigger animals, bigger prey animals, than a solitary, and it's less risky, because you've got one individual. It's a lot easier to get accidentally gored by a wildebeest than multiple.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, then you've got the advantage, of course. Usually, you can do that with males and females, isn't it?
Right.
So and even bigger group. But.
Okay, from Danish Debater, they want to know, what do you think is the most relatable mammal social behavior to human social behavior, and what do you think is the most unrelatable mammal social behavior to human behavior?
Well, as a semi-primatologist, someone who has one hat is a primatologist. I mean, I think something that has to be very relatable is probably social grooming, because we can. When you watch animals groom, you can really see that the bond building up there. The individuals grooming, you can often see them really are sort of just almost like dozing off and really enjoying it. And those two individuals is clearly sharing quite an intimate moment. I mean, again, we're anthropomorphizing hugely, but in terms of being relatable. And then I think we do that a lot. With our people who are our nearest and dearest, we hug each other, we stroke each other, we go off to the hairdressers, and some people enjoy going to the hairdressers apparently, and that's we enjoy doing that. And there are lots of other behaviours we can sort of associate with that. Sorry.
Oh, no, no, no. To your point there, when I was a kid growing up, a lot of times when I was probably in like elementary or primary school, younger girls would form like hair braiding chains. So you'd have 8 or 9 girls who would sit in a
Absolutely, there you
line
go.
and braid each other's hair. And it's very, very reminiscent of grooming chains, which is just kind of funny as a just.
No, that's totally the same sort of thing going on there. You're using, that sort of using that ultimately. What's the function there? You're kind of translating each other with friends.
Mm-hmm.
Be nice to me, be nasty to her. I mean, I was used to think the other behaviour, which I always thought was a step in the evolution of indications of, sorry, slightly silly, the step in the evolution of human postures was if baboons often sit with their knees up and their hands sort of over their knees, but they haven't. Sort of demonstrate that here. Because if you sit up with your knees, they sort of sit up like this. You can see on the camera.
Yeah.
But they never. What humans often do is then you pull. Put the seat back. But what humans will do, for them to spin around, is we'll then put our hands together like this. And I never saw a baboon do that. And so I figure that's like the next stage. When you can do that, then and not fall off your chair doing it, then that seemed to me like, it was another sort of in terms of relatable behavior. But that posture was always like, it's sitting like that. But then I put my hands
just kind of relaxing on the floor. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. When we were at Trentham, so every now and again too, Trentham, for those of you in the audience who may not know, it's a kind of like a monkey park in Trentham with a ton of Barbary macaques, and they're free ranging, so they all run around and do their thing. And one thing that I always kind of thought was relatable was like the absent-minded kind of self-scratch. Like they'll be sitting there and they're just kind of like, or they'll scratch their leg, or they'll scratch the top of their head. And I'm like, man, I do that all the time. I wonder if I'm anxious, It's like kind of silly, but it's. We've got this one's from Silver Harlow asks, what's the survival rate of field researchers? Low.
Well, I think there's a second part of that first question we'll come back to in a minute. But survival rate in terms of actual death, pretty fine. I mean, there obviously you always hear a few sad stories about people who have had accidents, but I wouldn't have thought there's any difference in accidents that people experience in their daily lives. But in terms of career survival, obviously there's not much money. I mean, you asked me what one of the challenges were earlier on. I think one of the big challenges is, maintaining funding for this sort of thing. It's not, it's very difficult to monetize. There's no, you're not working, mongooses and baboons are unlikely ever to, make you money, particularly. You're very much out of quite a relatively small pot, which is always a bit under threat. And I think, it's our job as ecologists and evolutionary biologists to make a case for why that's important.
Yep.
But yeah, as you go up the pyramid, if you like, it can become increasingly, there are fewer jobs available inevitably, and then people do need to eat and have a roof over their heads and that sort of thing. So that inevitably means that some people have to end up going doing some other things, which is very sad. But so survival rate there on that sort of career survival rate is probably pretty low, and I've been very lucky so far to stay in the game. But I'm sort of constantly aware of that.
It's like an anvil over your head. I'm sorry, you're right. We missed the second half of that previous question. Unrelatable mammal behavior.
Oh, I was thinking about that was anything to do with scent. I have a terrible sense of smell, which hasn't helped in COVID times, of course. Everyone's just thought I got COVID the entire times. But I have a terrible sense of smell. But I mean, anything to do with any sort of olfactory, scent marking. And definitely that overt scent marking behavior just, is unlike anything we as humans at least consciously do. So, for example, mongooses and lots of other scent marking things, they'll rub their butts all over everything because that's where then they have latrines and badgers do the same thing. And that just isn't something that's a thing for us, really. Although I say this, I don't know if you've ever seen videos of how people almost always smell their hands after shaking hands.
Really?
So obviously people are shaking hands anymore, but it was a thing that came out a while ago, and I don't know how truth there is in this, but if you see any world leaders shaking hands, they almost always, you think about, afterwards, just almost automatically, they just, you have that smell.
A reflex, yeah.
So.
Huh. Yeah, that kind of checks out.
So, and obviously there's this idea of like pheromones, and there's trials done where you give people different smelly t-shirts.
Yeah. I've seen some of those. The ones that I've seen or heard of, I guess, because I haven't actually like read the paper, but I've only heard of it tangentially. Is they were curious as to how the scent of male body odor impacted female facial preferences, and so they had them sitting at a computer, and underneath was, I guess, like some BO, like some nasty BO smell. And they were rating kind of male faces, and they tended to prefer, I guess, more masculine features when the scent was present versus when it wasn't. Which is, I don't know what that says. You got to be careful with some of that stuff because you get into some really weird zones. But
yeah, that's I mean, I think there's reasonable amounts of evidence now that potentially something slightly subconscious going on. But in terms of relatableness, none of us go around and think, I'll scent that, I'll scent that.
Yep.
None of us, if any of you have a dog, you take a dog for a walk, a dog spends the entire time just going on going, mine.
We've got 3 dogs, and so when we take them on walks, it's take 3 steps, and then everyone's got to smell everything, and everyone's got to mark everything. So it's like, okay, we maybe make it around the block before we're like, okay, we're gonna drop the rest of the walk. Jay wants to know if you have been influenced at all by Robert Sapolsky's work.
Well, definitely by his. He wrote a brilliant sort of as a popular account of his time working on baboons. His PhD working on baboons, particularly called a Primate's Memoir. And that is pretty much compulsory reading for anyone who comes and works on the baboon project I worked on. I'm sure it's the same for any other baboon project. Because it's such a good account of the trials and tribulations of field biology. And happy and sad, but really well written. And so in that regard, absolutely. It's actually just been in the US, but in the UK, it's just been republished. So I actually got given it again. Someone gave it to me for Christmas again this year, which if they're watching, sorry about that. I already read it, but because it's done so well. But in terms of his science, to some extent, and his science is definitely much more related with sort of obviously his PhD was on hormonal sort of stress effects of being high ranked essentially, and then he quite moved off more into kind of looking at sort of neuroscience related things, but actually more recently some of his more general points about the health effects of being social, health effects of stress. I've definitely come back into some of the things I've done. I've definitely worked on other projects where measuring stress levels have been a part of that as one way of measuring a cost and a mechanism that regulates sociality. But clearly he's in terms of his science, absolutely fantastic. Aside, he's got amazing facial hair as well. So it's
he gives a mean lecture too. I could listen to that guy talk for. I sometimes listen to his lectures when I like go on runs and stuff, which I do say so myself. I've been doing an excellent job of lately. So it motivates. He's it makes the time pass faster. Definitely, my favorite thing by him that I say on this channel a lot is, he was giving this lecture and he was like, behavior tends to be grouped into like 3 categories. He's like, there's the stuff that humans do that all other animals do, a lot of other animals do. It's just run of the mill behavior. And then there's the stuff that humans do that other animals do, but it's like tweaked a little bit, and other animals tend to tweak the behaviors in their own ways as well. And then there's the very smallest pool, which is things that humans do that are totally unique. And that those pools exist for all animals, which, I think is an important thing to remember. Stuart, when I was interviewing him, we were talking about the evolution of language, and he was like, we've got to take these guys on their own terms instead of forcing them into our, preconceived notion of what communication and language is. And I think that that's such an important aspect to consider whenever we're comparing behavior. It doesn't always have to be like, how does this relate to people? Like taking it on its own terms is like,
I think I think historically been very bad at both kind of trying to say, well, this is, there's been a sort of always a trend that this is what makes us human. We can do this and nothing else can. And then people do some research and go, oh, well, okay, maybe chimps can do it as well. Oh, and maybe bonobos. And okay, great apes can do it. All right, great apes and dolphins. All right, and crows. All right, apes and dogs. All right. And then, or trying to say, the classic thing I was just showing my first year students, and we had a session on like evolutionary trees, is they're old trees where people were up at the top. And there's this idea of this pinnacle of evolution. The point of being more recently, quite correctly, those sort of trees are more just shown in a circle. Like there's an origin point, and everything's just going out from there, but there's no top or bottom, and there's no sort of everything's adapted to where it is. I would say, that's the example I was telling my students is that if I took you and chucked you into the Southern Ocean in the Antarctic, you wouldn't do very well. But a penguin would be having a lovely time. But if I then put you in a penguin in a 100-meter foot race, you'd probably win quite easily.
Right. Yeah, because fitness. I mean, that's like one of the cornerstones of evolution and of biology. It's fitness is relative. Where are you? What's going to help you the most in that given situation? And I think that I think that you're absolutely right. Like every time I've seen like an older evolutionary tree, it's like, ooh, you got your humans. They're right there on the tippy top, which is almost a little bit. I mean, it's definitely a little bit narcissistic because it's like we've been around for such a short amount of time compared to most of the other stuff. It's just.
We are human. That's the thing. I mean, we are human. So it's not that perhaps that surprising. I don't think in many ways.
So not surprising
because that's where we're going to be. And obviously, back when Darwin was publishing his theories, and the idea was the very much the entrenched idea was that humans were the top of the. We were something special, and obviously all those ideas caused huge controversy because they challenged that whole dogma.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it would be remiss to say that humans aren't special, but so is everything else. It's like everything is special. Everything's cool in its own way, even when it's not your study species.
But your study species is better, obviously.
Yeah, obviously. Brainbug's got an interesting question. They want to know if mongoose have receptor mutations to help them resist snake venom, or has this, like your species of banded mongoose, or has it emerged independently in separate mongoose lineages?
Honestly, I have no idea. I would suspect, so it's worth remembering, so mongooses are quite a diverse clade, and not all mongooses, the mongooses you classically think of that attack need snakes necessarily. So it's not necessarily a sort of a clade-wide trait. I suspect, that sort of understanding those sort of mutations it requires some quite in-depth genetic work and probably hasn't really been done yet. I know, in terms of genetic work on mongooses and really in-depth genetic work on anything outside of a few real model species, there's very little being done. So there are quite a few projects now which are starting to try and sequence lots of more species, obviously, because it used to be, you have the human genome, and then we got gorillas and chimps and mice, because we use mice in lots of biochemical experiments and that sort of thing, and some other primates. But lots of, if you weren't in those few model systems, that you didn't have any sort of sequence data to work on. That has changed. There are institutes, the Broad Institute in the US and the Elam Institute in the UK, which are doing quite a lot of sequencing work. But it's still quite a big step from if you just sequencing an individual or a few individuals together, that just gives you a whole string of letters. You then got to work out what that means and where there's variation. And that's really been, for example, the Human Genome Project. Great, we got a human genome. Okay, what do these letters mean? And the next step is then trying to sequence, I think it's 10,000 or 100,000 people to start looking at variation.
Yeah, so, between groups and
individuals there. But pass on mongooses, I don't know. I suspect it'd be very. If it was there, it'd be very specific to a particular species that was particularly attacking or trying to particularly come into conflict with venomous snakes. With banded mongooses really don't. They get eaten by pythons quite a lot, but pythons aren't venomous and pythons are enormous and they just get eaten. And there are other venomous snakes around, but not in a huge way.
This has been very informative for my sympathies towards banded mongooses. They're going through a lot, you know.
You don't get attached. I mean, that's giving a contrast to something like a baboon where you've studied them for a long time. You know, they inevitably all have names. They've got some codes in the official record, but no one actually calls them by the codes. Everyone calls them by their names. Whereas in mongooses, they've all got codes, and then you haven't get codes because next time you come back, you're like, oh, new numbers. Oh dear, old one disappears.
Oh my god, that's so tragic.
There's a couple that have lived quite long, and then you start getting quite attached to those. But it's still like 186 is still there. Oh,
then it's a punch in the gut when oh my god. I feel for you, Harry. That I'm hurting for you because I'm listen. I get attached to rocks, so it's like I can't even imagine. House of Reason 78 wants to know, in your opinion, what lineage, I'm assuming we're discussing with mammals, has the most kind of understudied evolutionary history, and why do you suppose that is? From your perspective, I guess. I know that's kind of outside of your...
So I missed what has the evolutionary history? I missed, sorry, a bit of that question.
Like understudied.
Understudied. I mean, I don't know. What lineage has the understudied evolutionary history? I mean, something like an aardvark, which is all out on its own. It's basically the only representative. It's probably going to be a pretty understudied lineage, I suspect, just because there's nothing. It diverges from everything else in the mammalian clade, at least so long ago. If you don't study the aardvark, if it's only studying that species that you'll kind of get any information on its evolutionary history. Whereas, obviously, other lineages, you go back a bit and you get information from other species. Aardvark's also a weird one because they're actually pretty common, relatively. They're just so difficult to see because they're very nocturnal and very shy, even though they're huge.
If memory serves, I think it's them, elephant shrews, elephants, and maybe tenrecs that are all kind of like in this same very weird, almost offshoot group of, I think they're amphitheaters. I can't remember for sure, but I remember seeing that and I was like, aardvarks and elephants. I wouldn't have imagined that the two would be relatively closely related, but that does now that I look at them, I'm like, it does kind of check out a little bit.
I thought that your mammalian taxonomy is better than mine, but yeah, I mean, I think still they're very, in terms of where those diverge, it's still a long, long time ago. I used to work at the Zoological Society of London, and they when I was there, they started up as a major project, which is still going, which is, they call it EDGE project, which they made quite rightly pointed out that actually in order to decide, you've got to make decisions about which species to conserve. And obviously, level of threat is quite important. But perhaps that shouldn't be the only thing that's important, because if something's really threatened, but it's actually got 4 or 5, very closely related species that there's no problem with at all, then in terms of the amount of the evolutionary tree that you're going to lose if that species disappears, it's not very much. Obviously, ideally, nothing disappears, but it's a pragmatic argument that we don't have unlimited funds. Something's going to disappear. We've got to decide to put our money. And aardvarks actually came and they did this big analysis where they looked at how evolutionary distinct a species was. So essentially how much evolutionary tree it had on its own and how threatened it was. And aardvarks came out much higher than you'd expect, just because they're just their own thing. If you lose them, you lose a great big strand of unique evolutionary history.
Yeah, you get a lot of that too with like monotremes. It seems, like a lot of really weird stuff over in Australia, and once it's gone, and it's just...
another great example. Yeah, exactly. They are just like, there is nothing else like them. There's those as the platypus and a few echidna species, and that is it. they join up. Basically when the mailing trade kicks off, and then they disappear off and do their own thing, and
Yeah.
nothing, and that's it. Everything else just trundles along separately for the rest of the time.
Yeah, yeah. They're odd. Though you get over in Australia, you start to see some real odd looking mammals, which is a blessing for them, blessing and a curse. J. Don wants they want you to describe an interaction between a mongoose and a baboon. LOL. How would they interact with one another?
I'm sure I've ever seen that, and they must do because they do live in some of the same places. I suspect a baboon are probably trying to eat them. Baboons eat lots of things.
Them too?
Yeah, well, baboons will. I mean, not where I worked, and they're mostly pretty vegetarian, but they're omnivores, and they'll opportunistically grab. Sort of them eat spring hares and things, just like sort of rabbit-sized things, just because grab them. So I suspect they'd probably run after them. And might try and catch them. The mongooses would probably run around and hide under a bush and sort of chirrup at them a bit. And that would go on for a while, and then they'll all get bored eventually, I think.
Well, at least that goes okay for the mongoose that time. First time for everything.
I think, well, if they didn't get caught before, but I mean, I don't think the baboons aren't very agile, so I think the only time I've really seen them, they do in East Africa, they will hunt down small baby antelope, but generally, I think the only time I've really seen them catch something has been almost, like when it's sort of run out of bush in front of them, or they just grab and got it. Like once you get into a full chase, anything small, the small thing can do a tight turn, the baboon goes on like an oil tanker.
Yeah, they're fast, but they're not exactly like they don't have the agility, I guess, of persistence hunt like a Thompson's gazelle.
No, they're not built for that. It's opportunistic, they're perfectly able just to go and climb a tree and eat lots of things and stuff.
Yeah, the opportunistic omnivorous seems to characterize mammals a lot of the time. You get some real weird cases with some of that. So I've had you for about an hour and 26 minutes. We're approaching that hour and a half, and I know you've probably got a busy day, especially it's kind of getting late over there. So we got to stop the questions there. But thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and Harry, thank you for having this conversation. I've had a blast. I really have. Do you have anything else you kind of want to top it off with, or anything else you want to hope for the program, maybe?
Just say, thanks very much for having me. It's been a real pleasure. It's always nice to talk about field biology. Encourage anyone who's watching, listening. It's a great field to get into. If you're interested in doing a master's, then the one that Erica did, I can thoroughly recommend.
I can too.
It's a great field to be a part of. It's great. I was really lucky to get into it. But once you get into it, then you take you some interesting parts of the world, and you do some amazing things. You get to spend your day, talking about animals and talking about the cool things they do, and trying to work out why it is they do what they do and what that means for our understanding of the natural world and how we manage and conserve it.
The dream job.
About us.
Absolutely. All right. Okay, I'm going to end this broadcast, and everyone take care, and I will see you next time. Okay, ending.